hear me? Can you guys hear me? All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to introduce Ellie Pavlick. She's an assistant professor at Brown University. She also holds a joint appointment at Google AI as an academic partner and a research scientist.
Something like that.
Something
I
like
always
that.
check it.
Before then, she received her PhD from UPenn in 2017. And her work is within natural language processing. Very generally, that's the case. Specifically, she's interested in some very fundamental questions, such as, she's done phenomenal work addressing problems such as how do we as humans represent knowledge? What do computer models actually learn when they're trying to understand language and trying to approximate meaning? And how can we improve these models to better represent knowledge towards tasks such as doing inference? So I'm very excited to introduce Ellie and hear about some of her work. So let's give her a warm welcome to IACS.
All right, can people hear me okay in the back? Complain if you can. I don't always speak loudly enough. All right, great. So I'm going to give kind of an overview of several projects I've been working on over the past couple years, kind of trying to get around what our current state of the art language models actually understanding about language, and what do we think they should be understanding about language. I will just give shout out to a lot of my amazing collaborators that I'm covering kind of 5 papers in this talk. So a lot of the work was with Ian Tenney and Dipanjan Das at Google and Tom Kwiatkowski at Google, and then also some work with Tal Linson and his student Tom McCoy at Hopkins. And then my students at Brown, this is Charlie and this is Rohan, who doesn't have a face. Tom also doesn't have a face. So I think to kind of motivate overarching topic of this talk, or of kind of NLP in general right now, so if you look at kind of how the popular press and the media is covering current work in NLP, it appears that we are doing amazingly well, right? So we've been repeatedly passing the Turing test over and over again. And this is really based on these very high-profile successes that we've been having as a field. So we have like digital personal assistants that are pervasive now, and kind of these, what is often described as a kind of sci-fi moment when you see like speech-to-speech translation and things in like Skype Translator. And then things like, I don't know how many people saw the kind of the buzz around the GPT-2 language model that got released by OpenAI. So this is a passage that was produced by a machine, but it sounds like a human could have written it. It's just like flawless in the grammar, and it's kind of creative and interesting. And I like to point out, I don't know how many of you people are NLP people, but there's been a lot of really fundamental progress in NLP too. So there's a lot of tasks that we've cared about since the field started. Things like recognizing whether a word is a noun or a verb, or recognizing whether a specific noun refers to a person or a place or or organization or something like that. And on all of these types of tasks over the past just 5 years or so, since the kind of takeover of neural networks, we've been making non-trivial gains there too. But it's equally easy to find really embarrassing examples of how NLP fails. So this is, it used to be the case, I think this might have changed because Google changes on a daily basis, but if you asked which president married his daughter, it would just say Grover Cleveland, which is not true. It's a straight up lie. Grover Cleveland's not around to like call libel and slander law or something, but it's not true. There's just some passage that mentions Grover Cleveland and also mentions daughter, and the Google information retrieval can't tell that that's not an answer to the question, right? My favorite fails are the image caption fails. So this is the state-of-the-art image captioning model from a couple years ago that just says a horse in the middle of the road, and there's no horse in this picture, but it's just a great place where a horse very well could be. And so it's just like, sure, imagine a horse there. This figure is harder to read for, again, if you're not from an NLP background, but we basically spend a lot of time asking models just, does sentence 1 follow from sentence 2? And if you asked one of our best models, is the car blue, or you tell the model the car is blue, and you ask whether the car is not blue, and it says yes with 60% confidence, because it just doesn't really care about the small words like not. And so we get these kinds of, this kind of dilemma in general where it's kind of hard to say whether we're doing a good job or not, because we have all of these really clear wins and these really embarrassing fails. So I will give kind of the outline of at least my summary of where we are kind of in the field right now in trying to organize what it is we're doing well and badly. And particularly, I think what we're doing very well is we're doing a good job at encoding kind of the form and structure of language. So we're good at saying this is a plausible sequence of words, this is an implausible sequence of words, and we can do that in an actually incredibly robust way. But we're just doing an abysmal job at representing what those words actually mean. We just, like, we can spit out sentences and whole documents about these like unicorn text, and then, but we don't actually know what a unicorn is, and we don't know what any of these words that we're trying to use actually mean. So that's kind of the first half of the talk, and I could spend the whole talk on that, so I'll go through it as slowly or quickly as people want to interrupt with questions. But then I kind of want to go into the second phase, which is, okay, so that's where we are. So now what do we do? And just talk about two other projects that I have going on right now that I think are starting to get at, like, what do we do when this is the state of affairs? And there's a lot of kind of ways to probe into this mess. One is this issue of spurious correlation. So when we see models failing to represent the kinds of things we want them to represent, a lot of times they're doing that because they're picking up on kind of data set artifacts that they can easily exploit to make good predictions, and it's not the thing we wanted them to learn. So we're starting to try to dig into, well, under what conditions do they decide to do something smart, and when do they choose to do something stupid, and do we have any control over how that happens? And then the other issue that comes up specifically in language, and I think it's a really important one, is just how do we actually evaluate the models that we're training, and what counts as having understood language. And here it's actually quite hard, because we have a general sense of what humans do, that's what it means to understand language, but we have a really hard time kind of boiling it down into something we can quantify and actually test a model on. And then I'll give some pointers to some of our ongoing work that we're currently doing at Brown. All right, so we will begin with our upward check. So for this first part of the talk, or in general, I'm going to be talking about our kind of current state-of-the-art language models, which are often called pre-trained language models, or just language models, or contextualized encoders. And what these models are basically, they're deep neural nets that have been trained on this task of predict which word comes next. So you get as input some, you basically start the model and you say, okay, you're about to start a sentence. What do you think is the first word? And it says the, and you say, yeah, great job. Okay, you just said the, what do you think comes next? And it says, I don't know, car. And you're like, yeah, good, it's car. Okay, you said the car, what do you think comes next? And it kind of does this for millions of words, or for a large body of text. And then what we do, sometimes we care about this task by itself. We just want to spit out sequences of text, and that's what happens when we generate like the unicorn text. But very often we don't actually care about whether a model can do this. We really just care about the representations that we got for the words as an artifact of doing this task. And so what we do is we then use these vectors as the bottom layers for whatever other models we're going to build. And their assumption is that these are good representations of these words that will allow us to do lots of things. And so some work that my colleagues and I and a lot of others in the field have been trying to ask is, what exactly is encoded in these representations, and is it the kind of stuff that we think should be encoded in good representations of language? And so how we try to analyze this is we basically take this network, we freeze it so there's no new training that can happen, the parameters aren't allowed to move, and then we train some other classifier on top of that and say, given the representation that I have for the word car here, can I predict something like whether it was a noun or a verb? Or given some pair of word vectors, so I say you have the vector for the car and the vector for blue, and you're saying, giving this pair, do I know that there was some modifier type relationship going on here? And our hope is that if it's a really good representation of language, it should have to have encoded this type of stuff about not just what word was it, but what role was it playing in the sentence and what other words was it attached to. And so specifically within natural language processing, there's a lot of, we have a lot of prior work and resources around the types of tasks that we think are important for language understanding. And we've traditionally organized these into some kind of a pipeline. So we used to, before kind of neural nets, and even now within neural nets for different applications, we explicitly build models to do all these different tasks. So we'll say something like part of speech tagging. The goal is you take a sentence and you want to say which are the nouns, which are the verbs, which are the adjectives, things like that. Then after we've done things like part of speech tagging, we often do something like an entity recognizer. So there you're saying something like, is this noun referring to like a person or a place, or is it not? Or sometimes we have to do specific entity typing. So like, is this a celebrity, or is this a capital city, or something like that? Then we spend a lot of time on doing parsing. So we care about the kind of hierarchical structure of the sentence. So here we want to know that not only is a verb, but it has a subject, which is it, and it has an object here, which is a global brand. And then we want to do things like co-reference resolution. So we want to say that in this case, the word it and the word Disney are referring to the same like real world entity. And so, yeah, so these are a lot of the kinds of what we would kind of consider structural and linguistic tasks that we think models should understand. So some results on this. So if you, as a baseline, if you just say how well do you do at predicting all of these types of tasks, if all I know about the word is the identity of the word, so all I know is that the word was car, I don't know what sentence it appeared in or what appeared around it, you do pretty well at a lot of these tasks. So almost every time car appears, it's a noun. You don't need to know anything about the sentence. Or anytime the word blue appears, regardless of what the other word is, it's probably modifying. Like there's these kinds of heuristics you can use. So if you had a really dumb model, you could still do pretty well on a lot of these tasks. But the deep models that we're training end up getting very significant gains over these baselines. So in some cases, things like parsing, which is considered to be a pretty rich structural task, we get like 15-point improvements. Things like co-reference, so this identifying whether two words are referring to the same entity, also considered to be a pretty hard task. You still see like a 15-point a gain over baselines and pushing close to 90s or plus performance, which is close to some things human performance is 100, but often it's a little below. So we see a large amount of non-trivial linguistic information being encoded. And it kind of sustains over longer sentences too. So this purple line is our current best model, and you see that even for very long sentences where we expect performance to degrade for some dumber models, that performance actually sustains quite well. But I think something that's even like more interesting is that you can go a level further and you say, I don't just care that this information is there at all, but it has to be there in a particular way. And in particular, we have this notion of this pipeline. So we think that like not only should you encode things about part of speech and encode things about parsing, for example, but they should really depend on each other. So, so you can't really make good inferences about the parse structure of the sentence without first knowing the part of speech. So I will show a very loaded figure. So I'm going to walk you through a piece of it first. So here we're looking at one of the state-of-the-art models released from Google. So it's a 24-layer neural network. And what you're looking at here is each of these like gray bars is showing the layers from 0 to 24 in order. And of course, the kind of critical piece of information here is that the higher levels can depend on information that is encoded at the lower levels, but not vice versa. And what we're doing is we're training these kinds of classifiers, these what we call probes, on each of the different layers to say, do things like predict part of speech or predict constituency structure. And these blue bars are showing how important each layer was for making that decision. More specifically, they're like regression weights. Like we have to learn a linear combination of the layers in order to make the prediction. But you can roughly interpret them as how important is this layer for making this particular linguistic decision. We also have these purple bars, which just show a slightly different metric of how important the layer is, which is basically how many new examples are you getting right. OK, so here's all of our tasks looking at all the layers. And the main takeaway here, and I'm roughly ordering the tasks from lowest in the pipeline to highest in the pipeline when looking at kind of a traditional NLP pipeline. And you see this kind of ordering that happens where things like part of speech peak earlier on, and then things like parsing, which really should depend on part of speech, happen slightly after that. And then things like co-reference, which require having a good parse structure, happen furthest at the end. And I want to throw out that, so there's a maybe not, I can't tell how affectionate it is, phrase Bertology, because this model is called BERT, this deep language model we use. And so a ton of people have been like, why does it work so well, and doing this kind of analysis. And so it's been called Bertology, just the science of figuring out why BERT is working. But a ton of people have been working on this because it's fascinating how well BERT works. And so I just like to throw out that I'm highlighting my own work and my colleagues' work, but there's a lot of others in the field working on similar stuff and coming to really similar conclusions. So there was some work out of Stanford earlier this year, or earlier last year, that was showing you could kind of project the embedding space onto a parse tree and get very good parse trees out of the representations that were learned. There's some work from Jonathan Belenkov, who's probably here somewhere, does great work in this area. And so he's been looking at whether you can like find specific neurons within the network that correspond to some of these linguistic concepts, like, for example, tense of verbs. There's work from Yoav Goldberg and a lot of other people doing these kind of studies where you just say, can the models make good predictions about like subject-verb agreement, for example, and showing basically human performance on those kinds of tasks. So there's just kind of overwhelming amount of evidence right now that's basically no matter how you measure it, and we can have slight difference in kind of methodology or in the exact model we're using, but you see a lot of evidence suggesting that these models are really encoding a lot of deep syntactic structure that was kind of previously thought wouldn't ever really emerge out of these kinds of networks that are being trained to do this type of task, just predict what word comes next with no real baked-in knowledge about how language is supposed to work, that there's supposed to be things like constituents and parts of speech. But of course, like structure is one part of language, but we don't have language just to have it, right? Like we use it to try to communicate and have meaning. And that's when you start to see a pretty different story on how well the models are doing. And so here's one of my favorite tasks for modeling, not whether a model, I'm overloading the term model here. One of my favorite tasks for measuring whether a model knows something about language is what's roughly called the entailment task, or sometimes just the natural language inference. But the idea here is we want to give models a pair of sentences, so something like there's an apple, or there are apples and bananas on the table, and there are apples on the table, and we refer to this as the premise and the hypothesis, just our terminology. And you want the model to say that, yes, this is a valid inference. Given sentence 1, I can infer sentence 2. Whereas if you got something like there are apples or bananas on the table, you couldn't necessarily infer that there are apples on the table. So it's a pretty straightforward task, and quite flexible, which I think is nice. And it's commonly used to benchmark whether models are understanding not just like, yes, that's a good sentence, but what is the meaning of these sentences in relation to one another that allows me to make inferences. So if you look at how well models do on this task, one theory is they're reasoning about the meaning of the sentences, and that's what's allowing them to do well. Another is they might be using some kinds of dumb tricks that might be a good way to do well on this kind of task. So one such trick that models very plausibly could be using would be something like lexical overlap heuristic. And I just want to give credit to Tallins and his student Tom McCoy, who are at Hopkins, and they were kind of the primary people on this work, but it's nice, so I like to present it. So what we're looking at here was, are models doing something smart, or are they doing something dumb, like looking at lexical overlap? And lexical overlap is not a bad heuristic. Very often when two sentences have a lot of words in common, they have very similar meanings. In this case, you can see like the banker near the judge saw the actor, the banker saw the actor, like that's a valid inference. But it's obviously not a perfect heuristic, and it's easy to come up with examples where all the words in the hypothesis appear in the premise, but it's not, the hypothesis is not entailed. So if you say the judge by the actor stopped the banker stopped the judge, all of these words are here, but they don't, but it obviously isn't a valid inference. So what we did is basically just generate a ton of sentence pairs like this, some of which were entailed and some of which were not entailed, and just test how well models did on both sets of sentences. These are models that were doing pretty well on standard benchmark tasks or data sets for the same task. So they were getting at whatever state of the art was at the time, somewhere around 80% accuracy. And if you gave them these pairs of sentences where it was entailed, the inference was supposed to be yes, they got basically perfect accuracy because they always say yes, it's entailed. But when you give them the examples where it's not, then you see almost zero accuracy, well below random. So they basically, again, always say it's entailed, which suggests they are just doing this really stupid thing of saying if all the words are there, then it must be entailed. And I will again say that I'm highlighting work that I was involved in, but there's been a lot of kind of concurrent work showing very similar results. So there was some work also out of Yoav Goldberg's group saying like, what about like these words that are very close in meaning but have different meanings, so like tomato and potato, do models know the difference between those types of things? And they did some manipulations based around making these kinds of substitutes and showed that models that were getting good performance dropped to below random performance when you did these kinds of manipulations. There was some really good work from Percy Liang's group that was showing for question answering systems, like if you took a system that the task here is you get a question and a paragraph and you have to highlight the answer within the paragraph. And if you just tacked on some random unrelated sentence that shouldn't change the answer at all, then models that were doing very well at like 90% dropped to below 50%. Again, when they shouldn't have really been distracted at all by these random sentences. You can also play around with the models and say, like, what if I ask So these models that are trained to just generate text, what if I ask them to generate something that really requires reasoning about the meaning of those texts, and you can just see the garbage that comes out. So if you say, like, I put 2 trophies at a table and then another one, the total number is 5, which is, like, yeah, obviously wrong. And then it just starts rambling on about unrelated things, right? So we're kind of start to see this problem where a lot of really simple meaning type inferences seem to just fail abysmally. And I can't even go through all of the papers that, like, this has become a sport, and it's really fun to just find all the ways that models do dumb things. And so there have been a flurry of papers about it, kind of ramping up. I think they've slowed down now because we've all come to the consensus that, like, yeah, they're really not, like, it seems clear they're not encoding anything that's really satisfying as meaning in the way that anyone who thinks about meaning from a linguistics or a cog sci, or even just has an intuitive sense of meaning, would counting as meaning. So that's kind of my current summary of, like, what I think the state of NLP is right now. Is we've been just doing a great job at encoding form and structure and syntax, and that's a huge accomplishment because actually for a very long time, there's a lot of very still ripe debates about whether this neural net should be able to encode this kind of stuff. But we're really not getting close to understanding language in terms of meaning. And so then that leads to some natural questions about why not, and what types of changes should we be making to models that might make improvements here. And here I'm kind of segueing into some more ongoing work, and I wish I had, like, a kind of, like, tighter answer to these questions or some kind of conclusion, and I obviously don't, because this might take the next 20 or 50 or 100 years of work to figure out what exactly is going on. But I want to highlight 2 projects that I'm excited about right now that I think are kind of pointing in 2 different but important directions that we need to go in this space. So this is my debugging half. So I guess my follow-up to my why not question is, like, 2 kind of snarky argumentative questions that I think are, like, valid. So one was, like, well, why should they encode meaning? And I think this is a really important point to be thinking about right now. It's like we've trained them to do a task, and they're doing that task. And why did we think that task would encourage the model to encode something really deep about language? So I think this is a really important one, especially when we're giving them tasks and they're learning heuristics, and then we're kind of poking fun at them for having used the heuristics when actually, as far as the model was concerned, that was a valid solution. So that's one line of work that I'm really excited about right now, and I think we're just starting to look into. And then the second question is, how are we actually evaluating these models, and what counts as meaning, and how well are humans doing on the types of tasks that we're asking models to do? Or how well do humans agree on what meaning is in general? And I think this is quite challenging, and this probably will be the bottleneck on what allows us to make progress in NLP much before things like I don't have enough GPUs, right? It's like we actually don't know what it is we're trying to do. So we've been trying to do more work on figuring out what humans are doing and what they're not doing. So I want to show some results on that, but I'll start with the first question. So this kind of, I've been slowly shifting into this area more and more, and it's motivated by this observation that I just kind of highlighted in the past few slides. So we have something like BERT, our current, well, probably not the official best, depending on how you look, but like the big model everyone's using right now. And we have pretty clear evidence from our own work and from others' work that it's encoding structure. And then we have very clear evidence that even when it could have used that structure to make a decision, it didn't. And instead, it used something dumber that was more fallible. So why is this happening? And this is just like a general question of why should a model decide to use some deeper feature over a shallow one? And I think it's hard to answer and kind of reason about in the deep learning space because we use this paradigm kind of pre-training and fine-tuning, but in general, we're saying we're training a model and it's kind of jointly extracting features and also training a classifier on top of those features. So at any given time, it has to decide whether it should like learn better features or make better decisions given the features it has, or just kind of give up, right? And so we're in a kind of a weird space. And so the natural question that's been coming up, or the first instinct to everyone who's been like puzzling over this same kind of problem, is that it's just a problem with the training data. The training data did not provide enough examples for the model to make the connection between the deep feature and the task. And if it had, the model would have learned the deeper feature, right? Which I think is actually a really valid point. And if you look at this example, the information I withheld was that this is what the model's training data looked like. So basically 99% of the data had no lexical overlap whatsoever. And then for some sliver, 1% of the data, there was lexical overlap. And of that 1%, 90% were entailed and 10% were not entailed. So this 1/10 of 1% is what it was supposed to use to figure out the red data, the red example. So it's kind of unsurprising that it did a bad job. And if we just increase this a little bit, well, kind of a lot, but if we make it so that 10% of the data is now lexical overlap and it's a 50-50 split, suddenly the model is doing very well. So this observation has motivated people to say, like, okay, maybe we can just do this. Let's just augment the data with counterexamples to kind of show it why the deeper features are important, and then the model can just take over. And this has been coming up in the kind of work on syntax and structure learning that like I'm showing, and also a lot in work on like bias and fairness. So we don't want models to pick up on spurious correlations about like gender or racial stereotypes. So instead we can like add counterexamples in that space. So there's been a lot of work trying to propose this kind of data augmentation or counterfactual data augmentation techniques. I would just throw out that my interest in this project is I don't like this solution. I find it very unsatisfying, and so we were trying to come up with a more systematic way of studying, is this something that would work in general, to just keep trying to add counterexamples for all of the bad heuristics that we are worried a model might learn. So what we want to do is set up a really toy problem that we could like work on in a really controlled setting. So we're working with a couple of assumptions. So we're basically assuming the problem there's some true property in the data that is perfectly predictive of the label we care about. But this property is like hard to extract from the input directly. So this would be analogous to something like deeper syntactic structure or meaning, whatever that is. But then there's also these distractor properties, which are going to be highly correlated with the label we care about, but not perfect. And they're very easy to detect from the input. So this would be something like what words are in the sentence or something like that. And so our problem is set up something like this. We have our whole space, and most of the labels are negative, and then we have some positive labels, which the green is the true property here. So all the positive labels are where it's green. But then we also have these distractor properties, which are highly correlated. And so now the data augmentation piece is to say, well, let's try to decouple. Let's help the model by decoupling these red and green features by adding counterexamples. And so we can do that in two ways. We can add like these true-only examples by saying, let's add more examples where the true property is there with no distractor. Or we can add these distractor-only counterexamples where there's a distractor but no true property. And I'll talk a bit more about it later, but I think it's important to point out that there's very qualitative differences between these types of things. So these distractor-only examples are the type that I think we actually can add in practice in a real setting, because this would be like if we add more examples of lexical overlap that is not entailed, like we can generate those pretty nicely. Adding these true-only examples, I think, are more of a theoretical thing than a real thing. I don't know what it means in general to say we have only the true thing, right? Because all the models are doing is learning correlates of some underlying thing, right? So this would be like, let's add something that has only meaning and no distracting words. Like, I don't know what that is. So they're more of a kind of theoretical thing. But the distractor-only ones are realistic. And then what we're doing is we're measuring true-only error, which is how likely is the model to falsely predict a negative label when the true property is there with no distractor. This means it's failed to connect the either failed to represent the true property, or it's representing it, but it's failing to connect it with the label. Or we can have distractor-only error, which is that it still falsely thinks it has the heuristic, right? It thinks that the distractor property alone is enough to account for the label. Okay, so that's our basic setup. And what we're doing is, like I said, we're working with toy data and just like a basic RNN here. And so we have just like sequences of numbers like this, and we have a range of different properties we're looking at, and these are supposed to be increasingly hard, or different levels of kind of hard to represent given the input. So like a really trivial to represent feature is like, is there a 1 somewhere in the sequence? A harder one would be like, is there a duplicate somewhere, where the duplicate could be any pair of characters. And so we kind of approximated how hard these features were by looking at the loss curves and like area under the loss curves. And so you can see that here, like for contains 1, we didn't even show it here because it drops off like instantly. It learns it instantly. For some of these other ones, it trains for a while and it never really perfectly learns to represent the feature. So we basically can say we have some easy ones and some hard ones. Cool. And I was going to say, in all of our experiments, the distractor property is just, does it contain 2? So it's equivalent to this first one in terms of hardness. So we're asking several questions about like so is data augmentation feasible in general as a way to get the model to learn better features? And if it is feasible, how is its feasibility kind of affected by things like how hard the true property is, or how big the training data is, or the type of counterexample we're adding, whether these are the true-only versus distractor-only types, or how many other distractors there are in the training data. So I'll kind of whip through several of these results. I'll highlight the ones that I think are most interesting. So the first thing we were looking at was the hardness of the true property. And I think this was kind of unsurprising, but you can see like basically for properties that are harder, it takes a lot more counterexamples to get the model to reach the same level of error. I think that's unsurprising, but it's nice to verify. So you can see here, when the true property was something like contains 1, and we're using 2,000 training examples, it only really took like 10 counterexamples for the model to learn the problem perfectly. When we moved to things like whether there was a duplicate somewhere as the true property, it didn't really learn it to a good error rate until something like 1/3 of the data was made up of counterexamples, which is pretty infeasible, I think, in practice. But that said, we looked at varying the size of the training data, and there's, mixed results in here, but in general, we didn't see that it mattered that much. So if you add 10,000 training or 10,000 counterexamples, whether you're adding that to a training set of 100,000 or 1 million or 10 million, it didn't make a really big difference in terms of the overall error rate that the model eventually achieved, which that I found a bit more surprising. But I think the kind of most interesting and probably the biggest takeaway result from what we were doing here had to do with the type of counterexample that we're adding. So there's a lot going on in this figure. Again, there's always a lot going on in my figures. I like to pack in all this stuff. So I will walk through it. But basically, we're looking at something like a confusion matrix, not really. So we have along the columns, you're looking at different measures of the error type. So here, this is the distractor-only error and the true-only error. The true-only error is, again, somewhat like, is it using the heuristic? Is it falsely attributing the label to be due to the distractor property? The true-only error is it failing to represent the true property or it's representing it but failing to associate with the true label? And then on the columns, you have the different types of errors that are being added. And so the main point to show here is that on the diagonals, adding the counterexamples is helping improve errors there, granted not super efficiently. But on the off diagonals, we're actually not seeing a lot of evidence that counterexamples help for the other type of error. And this is most important, I think, in this top right corner. So what we're seeing here is that, except in the case that the true property was a really trivial one to learn, for the other ones, no matter how many times we added these distractor-only counterexamples, it never really learned to represent the true property and use it. It unlearned the heuristic, so it stopped making the mistake of thinking lexical overlap leads to entailment, but it didn't cause it to learn a better thing in its place, right? So I think that's a pretty important takeaway from the kind of usefulness of this technique, is that we can kind of whack-a-mole our way through lots of different distractors, but we're not going to force it to learn some better, deeper representation as a result of that. And I think it's especially important in practice because I don't think we actually can generate these true-only errors, or these true-only counterexamples in practice. And I will give an example of why I don't think that's the case. So let's say we're doing this for the entailment task that I've been talking about. So in this case, I start with some sentence pairs like Saturday was very cold. It was 90 degrees on Saturday. This is a good, this generates, the label should be contradiction here. But I want to train my model using some kind of true-only counterexample, so I need to remove distractors here. And I've learned from that previous work that I mentioned in the McCoy et al. That lexical overlap is a heuristic that they're using, so I want to generate a contradiction that still has lexical overlap. So I do something like this, like Saturday was very cold, not hot. Saturday was hot. And now I need to, there's some other paper that says you can't actually use negation words because that is, that's a heuristic that models pick up on for negations, so then or for contradictions, so I do something weird here, like the opposite of hot. And then there was like another one that says you can't use antonym pairs because mouths pick up on that. And so you end up with like these weird sentences, which are now totally full of their own heuristics that you're going to kind of go on the spiral. And you start running, and we've seen this problem a lot, is that now the models will just learn some little sub-network that's like, am I dealing with a weird sentence? That's clearly a counterexample that's been added. If so, use this set of parameters. Otherwise, use this other set of parameters. Right? So we did think about the case that we have multiple distractors, and we're assuming you can't remove them all at once because that's not realistic. But let's say you can remove at most one at a time. But you can still add distractor-only counterexamples. And if we do something like this, does this still get us kind of close to what we would have gotten with true-only examples? And the answer is not really. So we only went up to 3 distractors. And you can just see pretty significant differences, even just going from 1 to 3 distractors here. So whereas before you might have been able to hit something like 10% error after adding 5,000 or 25,000 counterexamples, now with those same 25,000 counterexamples, you're still up at something like 190% error. So my main takeaways, as I said at the beginning, is I don't think this is really a promising solution in general. Not only is it kind of unsatisfying, but I just don't think it'll work. And I think that kind of unexpectedly, or expectedly, but still worth pointing out, is that the models, if they don't have a really good reason to derive deeper features, they're not going to just do it. Like, they don't have like some inherent need to come up with a deep explanation for things. They're fine using heuristics. And that's probably not a bad thing in a lot of cases, right? And so if we know that's the case, and we think we can add these distractor-only counterexamples, we're actually not seeing that this is a way to get them to use deeper features. So they will maybe unlearn some bad heuristics and specific biases. That means there are probably some use cases where this makes sense. I think of the bias and fairness work. So a lot of this work has been on bias and fairness. And in that case, people are saying, like, not necessarily you should solve the problem better, just don't solve it this bad way, right? So in that case, maybe the distractor-only counterexamples make sense. But definitely in the case like syntax and things like that, this isn't a way to get them to derive like some deeper, more robust types of features. And we do see that when they're faced with multiple distractors, they seem to prefer to glom together several heuristics rather than learn a single good feature. Cool. So that's, I guess I'll just go all the way through and do questions at the end. So then I'll kind of shift gears entirely. So this is kind of on the modeling side, and I think there's just a ton of work to be done there. Basically, I did the annoying thing of saying, hey, that solution, I don't think it's a good one, and then not proposing another one, which is like a frustrating type of research. But I think there are other ways we can try to deal with this. But then a whole separate other question we have to deal with is, how are we actually evaluating meaning in general, or just language in general, but specifically meaning, because that's what I'm most interested in. And here I've been using this entailment task, which is my favorite, I think, among all of the semantic tasks we use. I think it's very flexible. I think you can reduce a lot of other problems to it. But it's definitely not very well defined. And it's coming from the way that we kind of got here was from formal semantics and logic. And there, when we talk about entailment, there's a very specific definition of entailment, which is that a premise entails a hypothesis if the hypothesis is true in every possible world where the premise is true. That makes sense when you're reasoning about like formal languages and logic. That's not really what we use in NLP. And we've never really used this definition. We use a much softer definition that's from Ito Dagan's work in 2006. And what we say here is that a premise entails a hypothesis if a human reading the premise would infer that the hypothesis is true, assuming a common human understanding of language and background knowledge. And we actually hedge this definition pretty heavily with stuff like typically and most common and things like that. So we're basically in this position where we're saying, we want the model to predict what's probably most likely true in the same way that humans do. And we have some notion that this seems like a doable type of thing. It's something like the probability of the hypothesis given the premise and some background knowledge. But we don't actually have a way of explicitly modeling this. And so what we do is we just ask a lot of people. We usually crowdsource it. We just ask a ton of people, and we take like a majority vote. And we say if a lot of people seem to have, on average, said that the premise or the hypothesis is entailed or not, then that's the right answer. And so that's fine in general. And like we crowdsource noisy labels all the time. But the question is this a good way to be getting to some kind of ground truth of what people think language means? So here's 2 examples of sentence pairs from one of our common entailment data sets that we use all the time in NLP. So on the left-hand side, it's a guy in a yellow shirt performs a balancing act on a taut chain near a canal. A boy is doing trick by the water. We have very weird sentences in NLP. And then on the right side, we have a young woman stands by a barbecue, and a young female is near a machine. And so in the original data set that was released, they had 5 labels on each test set pair, and they included all of them. And these are examples where we had high disagreement. So there was one person who said contradiction, 2 people who said neutral, 2 people who said entailment. And so that's fine, and variation is common in, like, there's a lot of noise in any labeling process, in particular crowdsourcing. And so what we were doing in this work was saying, like, okay, that's fine as long as the kind of typical statistical processes hold, and if we draw repeated samples, this disagreement will kind of average away, and we'll get some peak somewhere. So what we did is we asked 50 people on each of these pairs to relabel it, and then we ended up with distribution like this. So in some cases, you see that, yes, indeed, there seems to be consensus around neutral, and then you get some noise in the others. But here, these kind of disagreement sustains. Even as we ask a much larger number of people, there still seems to be some people who say neutral and some people who say entailment. And there's, I think, some disagreement baked into what counts as barbecue and machine in this situation. And so the kind of motivating question of this work was just in general for things like the entailment task or for these kinds of semantic tasks, is it okay to do this kind of aggregation? Because if we get a lot of examples like the one on the right, then it's going to cause problems if we use this as our ground truth. Okay, so for this, to set up the study, we have we took 5 different entailment data sets that are used in NLP. And these are 5 very different types of data sets. So a lot of people create data sets for this task. For other tasks, it's really, really hard to create data sets without artifacts. So they all have their problems. So we wanted to make sure we were getting a sample of different sentences from that have been created in different processes. So we're not like really stuck with a single, so we're not too reliant on a single set of artifacts. So these first 2 are coming from some kind of crowdsourced generation process. This middle one is like largely coming from like news data, and has some expert annotation involved. And then we have these ones that are kind of semi-automatically generated and filtered. It's not that important about the differences, except to say that there's a lot of different phenomena being covered. And so what we did is we took 100 sentence pairs from each one. We biased towards shorter sentences just because it's easier for people to label. And then we had 50 people label each pair, and they labeled it on a continuous scale, so they could go from -50, meaning definitely contradicted, to 50, meaning definitely entailed. And that was just to give them a lot of freedom to communicate their own uncertainty. And then we got at least 20 raters per person so that we could like center and normalize individual rater biases. And so the kind of method is we're basically trying to say, are these models, or are these distributions well modeled by a single Gaussian, or do we need multiple Gaussians? That's kind of the setup. So if we take some distribution like this, one option would be to say there's a Gaussian here, there's a true label that's somewhere between neutral and entailment, and we're just getting a sample that's breaking a bit awkwardly. But if we were to sample multiple times, a good model would be this. And if that's the case, then everything we're doing is fine. There's like a good argument to be made for some ground truth label in here, and we're just getting noisy estimates of it. And even if this is a very high variance model, that's fine too. It can just be a hard example that's a Gaussian with high variance. But if we're in a situation here that it's actually better to model it with multiple distributions, then we can't really say there's a single ground truth. Instead, it kind of depends on who you are, and different people have fundamentally different ways of reasoning about these sentences. So what we did is we took all of our groups of 50 ratings, and we split them into train and test, and we basically trained 2 models and tested on held out. We trained one where we forced it to fit a single Gaussian model, and one where it could train a mixture model where it could fit a single Gaussian, or it could go for however many components it wanted, up to a single component per person. And what we see here is just a scatter plot of the likelihood of the held out data for the single component versus the multiple components. And so y equals x line would mean you're getting no improvement from adding additional components into your model. What we see is actually a lot of the points, well, all the points fall on or above. And so for the ones that fall above, it means that the model was choosing to fit multiple Gaussians, and those actually did generalize to held out data over multiple runs. So this is pretty compelling evidence that, like, yes, for many things, there is one true underlying label, and that's fine. But often there's not, like more often than we really want to be able to ignore. We'll probably want to be able to ignore it, but we can't ignore it. So these additional components do actually generalize well. And you can look at the kinds of examples that people are disagreeing on, and they're very diverse. I couldn't pinpoint it to a single type of linguistic phenomenon that just if we had added clarity in the instructions about that thing, then people would have done better. So here's an example that's kind of a lexical semantics problem. It's whether swatting is necessarily forceful, I think. So half of the people say that no, swatting isn't necessarily forceful. Others are saying that, yeah, swatting is kind of like by definition. My other theory is it's whether you're from the perspective of Paula or the fly here. That's what I think the populations are. Another good example is what's a linguistic phenomenon known as factive verbs. So phrases like confessed that X are typically thought to entail X. If you confess that X happened, then X had to have happened. Whereas if you think that X happened, X didn't necessarily happen. So here you see a solid group of people that are saying, like, yes, if you confessed that a particular thing happened, then that thing happened. But there are a lot of people who are saying, like, no, it's very possible to confess to things that didn't happen. And actually, that happens in the legal system all the time, right? So you see this other group that says, no, this isn't necessarily an entailment. And then this example, I think, is just my favorite because it's so clean and it's such a it's an implicature example in linguistics. So here you say the capital of Slovenia is this. Does anyone pronounce it? Ljubljana, with 250,000 inhabitants, and you ask whether Slovenia has 250,000 inhabitants. And yeah, like half of the people are like, yeah, of course Slovenia has 250,000. Actually, the capital alone has 250,000, right? The other people are like, no, it doesn't have 250,000. The capital alone has 250,000, right? Like it's just like such a basic disagreement. But yeah, and I think, so a common question that comes up is this an issue of context? Like if we had just provided more context around the sentences, maybe people are making assumptions and they're just making those assumptions differently, and as we add more context, that'll go away. I can't answer this cleanly. I think this experimental design, there's some confounds in here, but we have some initial results where we were saying, like, what if we first collect labels at the word level, and then we go up to the sentence level, and then we go up to a paragraph in a sentence, and we see if the disagreements are decrease as we add more context. And we actually see, if anything, the opposite. So like, well, here's an example where you see when people were asked whether boating implies fishing or implies picnicking, they were basically centered around neutral. And when you gave them this sentence that says in the summer months it supported swimming, boating, and fishing, they were also centered around neutral. But then when you gave this whole paragraph that starts going on about the details of the canal and the water and giving other examples of water specifically, then people split into some saying, yeah, picnicking is implied here, and others saying no. Yeah?
Is there a demographic bias in the mechanical Turks as well?
We don't have that data on them, actually. They're just random hash numbers, so we don't know much about their, about who is doing the labeling. But I would imagine, well, it would be interesting. I'm not sure if these linguistic preferences for things like implicatures and factives and stuff break down demographically, or if they're just very personality-based. Yeah, that'd be cool to look at. I am quite sure that if they're trained linguists, they have their own set of, which is part of the problem, right? So like linguists have trouble sometimes, they're like, how could you possibly, right? Like who are these crazy people or something? Like often linguists have a different model of how language works. Yeah, so as we added more context, like I said, the results here are mixed. So when we're looking at disagreement here, both in terms of variance and in terms of the improvement in likelihood you get by adding, by using a mixture model over a single component model. Here we see in both cases the disagreement goes up as we add more context. There's only a significant difference between word and sentence and paragraph, but there's no difference between sentence and paragraph. But word is significantly higher agreement on both measures. So that suggests, if anything, adding the context might be hurting disagreement. It's probably not helping. But there's a few other confounds. Like I think that people get sloppier with those whole paragraphs. It's just a lot to read. So I think this work is, there's more to be done here, but it's definitely not pointing in the direction of adding more context is going to help fix this. All right, so that's my main takeaways, I think, is that the main takeaway is just that there are some fundamentally ambiguous cases in these semantic tasks that humans don't agree on how to resolve. And I think people agree that they're ambiguous, but what's really important is that when humans resolve that ambiguity, they do it in different ways, which makes it really hard to defend that we can build one single system that will just like do it how humans do it, because humans are doing it all in different ways. But it is important to point out that this is not preventing us from understanding each other, I think, as people, which might just mean these tasks that we're using are just not really an accurate representation of the kinds of things we should be asking models to do. We're asking them to make a single prediction about whether one sentence follows from another, when in fact people don't do that reliably, and yet we can all hold conversations and we don't get hung up on these types of weird things. And so I think, if anything, this to me points in the direction of we should be moving towards noisier, harder tasks rather than trying to simplify the tasks. And I think when we simplify the task, we end up doing this problematic thing where we've simplified the task in the wrong ways. And so it's actually made it so that we've done all the hard work for the model, and it doesn't actually have to reason about complicated things like meaning, because it can pick up on things like heuristics. Cool. So I just want to give a few forward pointers, kind of advertising for some of my current ongoing work, because my students have been doing really cool stuff, but it's just not quite in presentation mode yet. And so some of my thoughts about going forward, I mean, I already kind of pointed out this, but like summing up over everything, is that like I'm still pretty excited about deep learning models. Like I know there's been some pushback with all of the embarrassing failures, but I think they're actually fundamentally doing what we want them to do, and that's mostly based on how impressed I am with what they're doing in the kind of syntax and learning structure and things like that. So there's been, for a long time, people are like, no, neural nets can't learn like deep, rich, reusable structure like that. And we're actually seeing evidence that when given the task that requires it, they actually do learn it in a way that is very kind of satisfying, given kind of linguistic theory. So I think that the reason they're failing at the other things is we're just not giving them good tasks. Like they're not being given tasks that warrant learning real meanings of semantics, and so they're not learning real meanings of semantics. And so what I want us to do is just be using kind of harder, richer tasks that are going to add in a ton more complexity and mean progress will be slower for a little bit of time, but then hopefully will lead us towards like learning something closer to the thing we actually want models to be learning, which means learning language in a more kind of situated environment, in something more like how humans would learn. And so some of the work that I'm really excited about that we've been starting is working, so Brown has a great group in like robotics and visual computing and graphics, so we've been collaborating more with them to try to do some kind of word learning in situated context. This is Eugene Charniak playing with a ball in virtual reality, and narrating what he's doing as though he's talking to a small child. So you get this really kind of rich, cool language where you're saying stuff like, let's see if it'll bounce off, and then it'll drop off the edge, and like these very like fine-grained kinds of concepts about like what does it mean to bounce as opposed to fall, and what does it mean to be near the edge and fall off the edge, and all these kinds of things. And so then in parallel to the language data here, we have like really rich environment about what is the 3D like location of all the objects over time. And this could hopefully get us to learn some pretty rich structure about what words look like. So not just like nouns and verbs, which there's been a lot of work, or nouns and adjectives, and there's a lot of work in vision, but getting things like trajectories through the environment when we look at different types of verbs. So like when you pick something up versus put something down, it differs in terms of where the final position of the object is, or where you get something versus grab something. It kind of differs in the abruptness of the action and these types of differences. And then I think a really important part that I don't have a nice figure, I only have a schematic for, but we're doing a lot more work on that kind of interactive learning. So, so you can't just learn by passively watching language happen around you. And when kids really start to learn, it's because they're using language, and there's a lot of evidence that kids have a sense of the kind of communicative role of language and symbol grounding pretty early on. So you can do things like point and call out nonsense words and use them to refer to things. So we're trying to do more where the language learning is happening in these interactive environments where the robots are trying to follow instructions that are given to them, and they're also trying to give instructions to get particular outcomes and things like that. And yeah, I think that's all I got. So thank you very much.
So it's interesting that you stayed away from, you're clearly unhappy with any definition of meaning. quotes at one point. He said, whatever that means, explicitly. But clearly people have been trying to think about what
Yes.
meaning means.
Yeah.
So could you comment on their efforts and where you think they fail?
So yeah, so it's funny that it comes across that I'm uncomfortable. I mean, that's probably true. I bet all of the quotes are from having gotten yelled at for defining, because people have spent a lot of time thinking about it, and people have strong opinions, right? This is like, it's got a religious fervor to it. And so I'm pretty sure at any given point in time, I've defined it in a way that's offended someone in the audience. So now I've just been hedging like crazy. But yeah, I think it's a really, really philosophical question, which is why we're often afraid to talk about it, because we want to stay in the empirical world, right? And so, like, to me personally, I feel like I'm kind of this proponent of the grounded. Like, in order to understand meaning, you need to understand reference. Like, you need to know what is the thing that is being referred to by the language. And so that's why I'm really full on in the grounding setup. I know there's a lot of other work on the kind of more logical and formal semantic side that would say that symbol grounding is sufficient, and you don't really need to be grounded in the perceptual world. You don't need embodiment. You can ground to something like logic, and that is a defined model of meaning. So roughly speaking, I think people fall into like meaning should be represented in some kind of formal logical language, and that's really what's been dominant in linguistics literature. And then there's kind of meaning as like grounding in perception and experience and embodiment. And there's probably other types of theories, but those are maybe the two main ones. And I don't think either is completely wrong. I think the logical, I've spent a lot of time, I think the logical one just fails to explain a lot of human inferences. And so then that's been carving out increasingly, well, it's not supposed to explain everything, it's supposed to explain these subsets, but then the kind of pragmatist in me is, well, like, I want to just start somewhere else that I don't already know of all the places I don't know of all the limitations necessarily. But I think those are probably the two main camps, is some kind of symbolic logic ground to a formal language, and something that's like embodied, are probably the two camps. And I think that I'm more on the embodied side, or I am on the embodied side. I don't think the logic one is complete crap, right? But I think, yeah, I don't know if that was a satisfying answer at all. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your talk. To what extent is your work informed, just building on the previous question, to what extent is your work informed by experimental linguistics and philosophy of language? Because it's, sort of like, as you're going through this talk, I'm seeing sort of the Cheshire hat grin of philosophy and experimental linguistics in the boughs of the trees behind your research programs. To what extent have you fully exploited the resources available there to address this tough topic?
Definitely not fully exploited, right? But we're trying really hard. So I try really hard to be conscious of that. My students are, between all of them, each has a foot in some other field, I think. So one is kind of joint philosophy, one is kind of joint cog-sci. We were collaborating a lot with the Department of, it's cognitive psych and linguistics, all joined together at Brown. And the philosophy of language stuff, I have one student who's kind of spearheading that effort, and so we're trying to work more with that. I think this stuff has become really important. So like so traditionally the most common interdisciplinary work in NLP has been with linguistics, like formal linguistics. And during my PhD, that's what I mostly did. Because Penn, University of Pennsylvania has a really good kind of history on that. And I think that was nice, but then to the extent that the logical models aren't doing everything we want, and then we see that neural nets are actually succeeding in ways that the proponents of that, like proponents of those kinds of theories, were the ones who would also say neural nets won't be able to learn this kind of structure, right? And so we're seeing some things that calls that into question, which means now we have to pull in a lot more work. For a long time, and I usually have a slide on this, like NLP has been a very engineering field. So we've said, like, I'm just going to not touch any of that stuff and just focus on performing tasks as well as possible. So I'm just going to build you the best MT machine translation system, and I don't really care about whether the representation is the real meaning of language as long as it does good at MT. But we've been moving towards trying to be much more ambitious, and now we've basically opened up the floodgate of, like, yes, everyone else has also been thinking about these really hard questions. And now we're trying to say my model just like knows language full stop. And so then, like, but this has happened very recently, like past 3 years, that we've been saying that NLP has been trying to do more than just engineering, and suddenly all of this comes in. So my lab specifically, we work with psych and cog-sci and linguistics, and starting to work more with philosophy. And then we also work with the kind of reinforcement learning and planning and kind of the non-language but other models of cognition and embodiment and things like that. There's so much there, so I don't think I'll ever be able to say we're fully exhausting those resources. But I think you're absolutely right.
Maybe one last question, we can take the rest.
Yeah.
It seemed like your distractor functions were mostly based on word collocations, which seems very appropriate to word training as it's commonly done.
Yeah.
But yet you're also discussing the gap between this kind of thing and meaning. I was just wondering, like over, I guess to get starting from there, but do you see your distractors evolving and taking more kind of meaning type things, or even something syntactic along the way?
The distractors to take, yeah. So I think, well, I don't know. So the way, and you can tell me if you disagree. Like I was kind of thinking these distractors are like a proxy for an easy thing and a hard thing, and we're trying to do some work now, like to the extent that one is easier than the other, does this kind of thing generalize? So it's like you can always kind of up the ante for how hard the distractor is, like because you can basically keep getting deeper and deeper distractors up until you're short of the real thing. So I'm not sure whether I feel I would learn a lot more from, in this particular setting, from having richer models of distractors. I would have to think like whether I would have a clear hypothesis that like if the distractor was harder, that would somehow change something about the learning dynamics of the problem. But I think right now we haven't talked as much about that and more about how do we get it to avoid distractors. Basically, how do we get it to, given that there's an easy feature and a hard feature, however those manifest, how do we get it to prefer the hard feature if the hard feature is the one that's necessary and not quit when it has the easy feature? I'm not sure if I answered the question.
All right, so in the interest of time, let's take the rest of the questions offline. But again, this is really fun material. It's really important, right? I feel like the current culture, the community that we're all in within machine learning, we're so obsessed with kind of this short-sighted progress is